Hello everyone, it's Olivia here, aka Story Minded, and I'm making another IGCSE video for English language. I'm going to be talking about, I had a request to do about paper 2, which is the prose/poetry text and imaginative writing. I haven't had a chance, I don't have the time to write a full essay answer to question 1, but I decided to more so use this video to talk about the importance of planning and why I feel that students should plan their essay answers for their longer exam questions. And I've written a plan, I've written an introduction for the question, but I've also jotted down what I would do for each part, and I'm just sort of going to talk about that and the importance of planning and why I think it's an essential skill to have. And then I'll also have a quick look at the 3 different creative writing prompts you could use, and also, once again, planning is key. So the reason why I say that planning is really important, especially if you find English challenging, and even if you don't find English challenging, I think everyone needs to plan. It links in with your assessment objective relating to structure and coherency, so how clear your argument is. If you don't plan and you're under the time pressure of exams, you're more likely to kind of be frantically trying to write about anything because you're clutching at straws, you're not necessarily sure where your answer's going, and you might end up panicking, and then you just write a bunch of lines that don't really have any relevance or meaning to the question. Whereas planning shows that you're really taking a considered approach to your question. And in the exam booklet, or you could always ask for a scrap piece of paper if you don't want to write your actual plan in the exam booklet, but you are allowed to do that. You can plan each paragraph, so your introduction, however many paragraphs you end up having, and then your conclusion, and you can plan what quotations you're going to use, and then it really shows that it's active thinking. You're actively thinking about what you want to write about and how you're going to write about it and how you're going to utilize those quotes, rather than just going off the cuff and trying to piece it together as you go along, because that's really not going to work. And they sort of give you recommended reading time, and within that recommended reading time you should also take the time to plan. It will save you so many issues down the road if you plan before you actually start writing your essay answer, because it's going to be clear, and actually in a way it will save you time during your exam, because you're not panicking or stressing thinking, oh my god, what am I going to write about, and looking at the clock ticking down. And it is a really hard skill to learn. Even for me, where English is one of my strongest subjects, I really used to struggle with planning, because I would have the opposite issue. I would have so many ideas, coming up with ideas or coming up with an answer to a question wasn't the issue for me. My biggest issue is that I would have so many ideas, I wouldn't know what to use, and then I would overwrite. So it can really help if you're on the opposite end of the scale, where you find English accessible and you can come up with answers, but you struggle to know what to use. Planning is also really essential for you to ensure that you don't over-explain and you don't end up losing succinctness and clearness because you're sort of rambling on too much. Because if you ramble on, you can end up losing the sort of sharpness of your answer, and then the examiner is just going to get lost in your work and they won't actually know if you've managed to answer the question or not. So the question for paper 2 is, back in 2016, the paper, is remind yourself of whistle and I'll come to you. How does the writer create feelings of isolation? And then they give you a list of things you should write about. But if you can come up with different answers to this, and so long as you're answering the question, don't be afraid to go outside. Don't feel like you have to answer specifically on what they're sort of guiding you towards. It's just to try and help spark ideas, but you can make any relevant point so long as you're answering the question about how does the writer create feelings of isolation. But the suggested ones they give you are the weather/setting, the effect and the effect of the writer's childhood memories, and then they use the last bullet point to remind you of what this assessment objective is all about. It's use of language and structure. So, and then it mentions obviously close reference to the passage and brief use of brief quotations. So I would recommend for a 30-mark question you should be aiming to get, although obviously it depends, if you want to do 2 larger points, that's fine. But I would argue you end up with 4 PDay paragraphs, and I'll explain what that means in a second. So you want to aim for 2 language points and 2 structure points to make sure that you fully answer the question and you're giving yourself enough evidence and consideration of the question. So a PDay paragraph is point, evidence, explain, develop, analyse, explain. So this is a technique we were taught many years ago back at GCSE. I don't know if they still teach it in schools. They might do, they may not. But just to give a quick little guide to it, and once again, you don't have to use this format when answering your essay question. If you have your own writing style, so long as it's clear, you can answer the question in any way. But for some people who find it quite difficult to do that, it could be a really good little mental checklist to have to help guide you through your answer. So the first thing you would do is you would start with a point. So for example, let's say we're doing our language PDay paragraph. So you might start with a point saying, the violent metaphor creates feelings of isolation through whatever. Then you put your quotation next to your point, and you can do like a little comma next to it, next to your point to back up the point you've just made. Then you're going to explain the relevance of why this creates feelings of isolation. Then you get to D, you're going to develop this further. So you might look at, you might start exploring the writer's intended meaning, like why have they chosen to use this particular technique to create the feelings of isolation. You might start considering the impact it has on the reader. Then you're going to analyse what you've just talked about further. So why is it relevant? Why is it relevant that the writer wants the reader to feel isolated? Or what is the relevance of the technique they've used to show the character's feelings of isolation? And it's basically just going that little bit deeper to really drive your point home. And then the final explain, which I didn't do in my last video when I was writing my mock answers, which I really should have thought about, but I didn't. The final one is another explain, but what I would argue is that what they actually want is you to summarize your point. So imagine each mini paragraph you're doing in your essay answer is its own self-contained argument. Your final point of that paragraph should wrap up that paragraph. So if you've been looking at that metaphor, you could your final point could be something like, overall, the violent metaphor that the writer has used to describe the weather creates feelings of isolation through. It's just basically summarising what you've talked about in that paragraph. And it's a really good way of signposting to the examiner, like, I thought about this question, I know what you want me to answer, I know what the question is about even, sorry. And it just really shows them that you have clarity and you understand what you're doing. You're not just going off the cuff. You're not just inventing things. You actually have analysed the text and you're getting your answer from the text, which is what English language and literature is all about. It's not just invented, it is derived from the text. So that's just a quick example of what PDay is. And once again, you don't have to write in that style. It can be quite... If you utilise it well, it can help you. If you do too much tallying, it needs to be it needs to be more subtle and light. I think sometimes some students who struggle, they try to use techniques like that, but they make it really heavy-handed, and then the writing of your essay sounds clunky. It should flow, it should make sense, and it should flow. So you don't want to be repeating yourself. You want to be pushing your argument forward all the time. You don't want to be going backwards. So the introduction I came up with for the question was, and another thing I forgot to do in the last video, I couldn't find the surnames of the writers. I think I probably just didn't read it carefully enough. But what I would recommend is when you talk about the writers, you can use their surname, never use their first name. If you, in the beginning of your introduction, you want to say the full name of the author, that's fine, but make sure in your main argument you just refer to them by their surname, because you don't know them personally, and also it's just for the formal tone of an essay. You wouldn't talk about their first name. So I've written, Hill uses relentless stormy weather, nautical and spectral imagery. Nautical is just relations to like navigation, and sea is basically sea imagery, and spectral, which obviously relates to ghosts, spectral imagery, and the narrator's solitary reflections on their happy childhood to convey isolation. And that's literally just like a single sentence introduction to clearly show I know what I'm talking about. And that's another reason why you should plan. If you've planned your answer, you know exactly what you're going to be talking about, and therefore you can create a really strong introduction to show your examiner, I thought about this question, I know the techniques that I'm going to talk about, this is what I'm going to talk about. In my introduction, I could technically go one step further and even mention the structural ways that Hill has used to convey isolation, but at the time I didn't know sort of what structural points I would want to make. So you can always edit your answer if you have time at the end. It's always good practice to edit your essay answer, and you can add things in. But one thing I would warn about in your introduction, do not fall into the trap of starting to put your main body of your argument into your introduction. You should never ever have quotes unless you're responding to a quote and you're using it for emphasis. Never ever use a quote in your introduction or in your conclusion. Your conclusion is the summary of everything you've talked about. It's not for new ideas. That should be done in your main body of your paragraphs. Otherwise that becomes a structural issue which will impact the assessment objective you have regarding coherency and SPAG and everything like that. So for paragraph 1, I sort of jotted down the quote that I would want to use, and I've got, the house felt like a ship at sea, battered by the gale that came roaring across the open marsh. And I just put a note to say, analyse the simile, explaining how this creates a sense of isolation, and just dissect multiple areas of the quote. And that's another thing you can do with the develop and analysis part of PDay. It's sometimes students will have a brilliant quote. They've identified a quote that is relevant to the question, but where they fall short is that they don't push it further. They don't push it enough. They don't use it enough. They like say one thing about it and then they move on. That's not going to get you the higher marks in the exam. You need to literally use, well, not all of it, but as much of it as you can, as much content as you can squeeze out of one quote, because that's what gets you the higher marks. I think sometimes students panic and they think, I have to write so much, and it's like, no, it's much better to have less quotations but go into detail and depth to pull out that argument, rather than having loads of sporadic little quotes that don't actually add up to anything. It's about building weight and it's about building your argument. So in here I've got, like, I could talk about the verbs, I could talk about the setting of the open marsh, I can talk about the simile, the house felt like a ship at sea, and the violent verb of battered by the gale, and, you know, I can really, there's so much I could pull apart in this quote to say how that creates a sense of isolation. Because, I mean, a marsh itself is a very solitary setting. And then what you can do throughout your argument is, as you bring in your new points, you can also refer back to what you've talked about and how it builds up. So, like, we have a solitary narrator who's telling us this story, and they're living in this, like, house on the open marsh, and they're the only human there. They only have a companion, Spider the dog. So they're the only human for miles on this marsh. And a marsh is a very boggy, dangerous environment to be in. So if you live on a marsh, they're like really hard to inhabit. So therefore that already conveys a sense of isolation. The fact that it's a marsh, it's like Gothic literature 101. Put your house on a marsh and no one will be there. So paragraph 2, and this is another thing you can do. If you're not too sure what quotations you want to use, you can jot down both of them. Like, I don't know if I would have used both of these quotations in my actual answer, but there were two that I really liked. So for my second language point, this is paragraph 2 for my next language point. I wanted to use like the tumult of the wind like a banshee, and the banging and rattling of the window in its old ill-fitting frame. Windows were rattling everywhere, and this is the other quote, windows were rattling everywhere, and there was the sound of moaning down all the chimneys of the house and whistling through every nook and cranny, because that contains kind of the spectral imagery, like the verb moaning is associated with ghosts and mourning and pain and grief. We have like a banshee, another simile, and that's a spectral idea, because a banshee comes from folklore, and I'm not sure if it's meant to be Celtic folklore or from other cultures, but basically a banshee is like a woman-like figure, and they were meant to be omens of death. So if you saw a banshee, it was meant to foretell your own death, and if you heard a banshee's cry, it meant either death was coming to you or a death had occurred. So that's kind of, once again, really conveying this sense of isolation and foreboding and all these negative emotions. So that's kind of what I would have talked about for that part. Paragraph 3. Sorry, someone's texting me. Paragraph 3, structural change. So this is my first structural point, and the sort of quote that I had is, and once again, you can edit quotes down. So if you use a square bracket, ellipsis, square bracket, you can cut quotes down, because sometimes you don't need all of the information in the quote, and you can save yourself time by just acknowledging to the examiner, like, yes, I've edited this quote, but I've taken it out for a specific purpose. So the bits you cut out, you can put the square bracket before or after, depending on what part of the quote you cut. So I had lain in the warm and snug safety of my bed in the nursery at the top of our family house in Sussex, hearing the wind rage round like a lion, howling at the doors and beating upon the windows, but powerless to reach me. So I was sort of thinking about the structure of how you can literally explore the structure of how the wind changes and morphs, and how the wind is constantly there. But there's the structural change, because when they're reminiscing about their childhood, the wind is still present, but they felt safe because they were in a nursery and they were snug and warm and safe. So it's that kind of following the structure of the wind and how the wind changes, and then also talking about the idea of repetition. Repetition is a structural technique, but I've used that in paragraph 4. But in that paragraph with the structural change, I could also talk about how, like, this wind is like, it's morphed into something more dangerous, and they're no longer protected, and it conveys a sense of isolation because they're now out in the world as an adult by themselves, presumably, or a young adult, and they're sort of defenseless to it now, and different things like that. And then paragraph 4, repetition mirrored. I reflected on how long Eelmarsh House had stood here, steady as a lighthouse. So once again, we have the nautical imagery. Quite alone and exposed, bearing the brunt of winter after winter of gales and driving rain and sleet and spray. And it's like, I could talk about the personification of the house, but the repetition is mirrored. So further down, I've also taken another quote from the end of the text, and it's usually good practice if you can get something from like the beginning, middle and end of a text, or like at least quotations from different parts of the text. That also shows that you've fully thought about your question, rather than just taking all your quotes from the beginning of the text, because then that kind of suggests to the examiner that you've been idle in your approach. You kind of want to show that you've fully considered the whole text. And again and again I heard that child's terrible cry borne on the gusts towards me. So it's like the repetition, like bearing the brunt of winter after winter, and again, it's this whole idea of relentlessness. Like, this poor narrator cannot get a break, and they're constantly bombarded by this wind and this sorrow, and that's a very isolating feeling when you can't escape from negative emotions. It's like emotional isolation as well. They have no one to share their pain or their fears with. All they have is Spider the dog, and although animals are great companions and they can be very therapeutic, human contact is essential. Humans need other humans. So there's a lot you can talk about how that conveys a sense of isolation. They have no human contact to confide in. And then finally, for the conclusion I just mentioned, so conclusion, to summarise what you explored in your essay and the significance of how this creates isolation. So basically you take all your points you've talked about and you just reiterate, but explain it with purpose and how Hill has created isolation. So, like, in conclusion, Hill has created isolation through her use of and like you just go on and wrap it up, but you don't want to add new points and you don't want to add anything to the conclusion. because that's not good practice. And then just very quickly, you have free writing prompts, creative writing prompts to pick from, and it always mentions real or imagined. So if you're more confident with writing creative autobiographies or non-fiction pieces, you can go for that. But the free prompts you can pick from are: write about a time when you or someone you know had an unexpected experience, write a story with the title Left Behind, or question 4, look at the images provided, so you have picture prompts. Write a story that begins, I wanted to make my own decision, and then the images you have to inspire you are the person sitting on a pier, and then image 2 is like a mind map, and it's like problem to solution with who questions lead into it. Out of all 3 of these questions, I personally would probably go for write a story with the title Left Behind, because I feel like that could inspire a lot of ideas. But once again, just as with your essay questions, for creative writing, it's essential that you plan. It's something that's I'm very bad at and I'm trying to get better at, but planning is essential for creative writing, because once again, it's when you're telling a story, you're trying to convey a clear idea, just like writers do. And if you don't have a plan that you're following through, it can make your plot weak and your story weak because it's not structurally sound. That's not to say that you can't play with structure and make it exciting. I mean, you can sorry, I'm just trying to get rid of something on my computer. You can, for example, start at the end of a story. You don't have to follow the convention of, oh, it needs a beginning, it needs a build up, it needs a resolution, it needs an end. You could start with the ending. You could start in the middle of your story, in the middle of the action. You can be creative. It's just you need to know what you're working towards, and especially with the time limit you have, I mean, it's even more essential to plan, because you don't have all the time in the world to like write a novel. It's more so trying to convey a clear idea and just try and achieve as many marks as you can. And also, from your previous essay question, you can take inspiration from the writing you've just read. Like, you could set up your own sort of horror story in a house, or you could talk about an abandoned house. Like, don't be afraid to use the text itself as creative stimulus, so long as you're responding to the creative writing question. You could write about anything, but don't fall into the trap of then plagiarizing the text that you've just read, because you don't want to basically take chunks of Susan Hill's writing and use it in your actual creative writing essay. But in terms of inspiration, if you want to set your story on a marsh, set it on a marsh. But yeah, I hope this video has helped in some way, and when I get time, or if I get time, or when I get time, I will try my best to go through the assessment objectives for each question more carefully and just look more so at the amount, like the marks and different things like that. Anyway, I hope this helped. Any questions, as always, please feel free to leave a comment below, and I hope you all have a good day. Bye.